The sterile air of the FBI Forensic Science Division examination suite always held a faint, metallic tang, a ghost of countless analyses. It was a smell I knew intimately, a scent of order imposed on chaos. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting a stark, shadowless glow on the stainless steel surfaces and the array of specialized equipment. Tonight, the suite felt particularly heavy, the silence broken only by the soft whir of the ventilation system and the occasional click of my own instruments. I stood over a sprawling evidence table, a landscape of devastation laid out before me. These were the first tangible pieces from what remained of Dr. Aris Thorne's high-security research lab. The initial reports from the scene were grim, painted in broad strokes of fire and structural collapse. The bioengineer, a recluse known for his groundbreaking work, had been found amidst the wreckage, a victim of what the preliminary assessment called a catastrophic lab accident. My gaze drifted across the collection, blackened fragments of what might have been a containment vessel, twisted wires fused into grotesque sculptures, and samples of scorched, unidentified organic matter sealed in clear bags. A detailed photographic panorama of the crime scene, projected onto a large wall monitor, showed the full extent of the destruction. The images spoke of immense heat, explosive force, and utter finality. "Looks like a furnace blew," the lead investigator on the scene had remarked to me earlier, his voice echoing with a weary resignation. "High-pressure system, volatile compounds, a brilliant mind perhaps pushed too far. It happens." I didn't argue. Not then. My job wasn't to speculate from a distance, but to sift through the debris, to listen to what the silent evidence had to say. And the evidence, even in its mangled state, always had a story. I picked up a piece of what appeared to be a control panel, no larger than my palm. Its plastic casing was warped, bubbled, and scorched black, but a small section of circuitry remained partially intact. The heat had been intense, enough to melt copper traces and fuse components. My gloved fingers traced the distorted edges, feeling the rough texture where plastic had liquefied and resolidified. The official timeline suggested a rapid, uncontrolled reaction. A sudden spike in energy, a cascade failure, and then the devastating explosion. It was a plausible narrative, one that fit the visible destruction. Yet, as I magnified the control panel fragment under the stereo microscope, a flicker of discord caught my eye. The burn pattern on this particular piece wasn't uniform. Most of the plastic showed the characteristic blistering and charring of intense, widespread thermal exposure. But in one minuscule area, barely a millimeter across, there was a different kind of mark. It was a precise, almost surgical scorch, a clean line cut into the melted plastic, distinct from the surrounding chaotic damage. It looked less like the random fury of an uncontrolled fire and more like the focused application of extreme, localized heat. I adjusted the focus, bringing the anomaly into sharper relief. The edges of this tiny line were sharper, more defined than the diffuse burn patterns nearby. It was as if a miniature, intensely hot blade had been drawn across the surface, leaving a signature utterly unlike the general destruction. My brow furrowed. If the entire lab had been engulfed in a catastrophic thermal event, why this singular, precise mark? It felt deliberate. My internal clock registered the late hour, but the exhaustion was a distant hum. This was the kind of detail that kept me going, the subtle dissonances that pulled at the edges of an otherwise coherent narrative. A massive explosion should leave broad, sweeping damage, not a surgical incision. I moved the fragment carefully, rotating it under the light, trying to find an angle where it made sense. It didn't. The line was too clean, too contained. It didn't radiate outwards like a blast's heat would. It was a scar, not a symptom. I brought up the initial incident report on a separate screen, scrolling through the preliminary findings. No mention of anything like this. The on-scene investigators, understandably, had been overwhelmed by the sheer scale of the devastation. They were looking for the big picture, the obvious indicators of an accident. The deceased bioengineer's work involved highly advanced biological engineering, often requiring precise energy inputs and controlled environments. Could this mark be related to his research, a unique signature of his equipment? Perhaps. But if so, why was it so isolated, so out of place amidst the general destruction? And why did it look like it had been applied before or during the initial moments of the catastrophe, rather than being a consequence of it? I leaned closer, my breath fogging the eyepiece for a moment before I pulled back. My mind raced, piecing together possibilities, dismissing most of them as quickly as they formed. A directed energy weapon? An incredibly sophisticated ignition device? The idea felt outlandish, almost fantastical, given the official pronouncements. Yet, the mark stubbornly refused to conform to the accident theory. This wasn't just a miscalculation. This wasn't just a tragic accident. This small, almost invisible detail suggested something far more intricate, far more sinister. Someone had gone to extraordinary lengths to hide their tracks, to make a murder look like an act of God or a scientist's folly. And they had almost succeeded. Almost. I carefully placed the control panel fragment back on its sterile tray, marking its position with a small, orange flag. I knew then that my work had only just begun. The prevailing narrative was a carefully constructed facade, and this tiny burn mark was the first crack. I would find the hand that made it. It felt like a deliberate counterpoint to the controlled chaos of the scene I'd just left, a cleansing breath before diving deeper into the grime. The air here was cool, metallic, devoid of the acrid tang that still clung to my clothes from Thorne's research lab. I stood by the observation window, my reflection a pale, distorted ghost in the glass, watching the medical examiner work. The room beyond was brightly lit, every surface gleaming stainless steel. Dr. Aris Thorne's body lay on the examination table, covered by a white sheet, awaiting its final unveiling. The medical examiner, a seasoned professional with calm, precise movements, adjusted her gloves. "Ready, read," his voice came through the intercom, steady and unhurried. "As I'll ever be," I murmured, more to myself than to her. She pulled back the sheet. The sight was, as always, sobering. Thorne's face was largely untouched, a testament to the blast's directionality, but the rest of his body told a different story. The primary damage was consistent with a rapid, intense thermal event, followed by concussive force. Charring was extensive on his upper torso and arms, particularly the right side. Initial assessment confirms severe thermal trauma and blunt force injuries. The medical examiner began, her voice clinical. Cause of death appears to be a combination of blast trauma and acute thermal shock. I nodded, my gaze fixed on the body. Anything jump out? She moved closer, pointing with a gloved finger. The pattern of charring on the right arm, specifically the forearm, is unusually concentrated. Almost as if he was shielding something, or perhaps, holding something that detonated directly against him, rather than being caught in a broader explosion. My brow furrowed. That was an interesting distinction. A lab accident, even a catastrophic one, usually resulted in a more diffuse pattern of injury, a chaotic spray of damage. This suggested a focal point, almost a direct point of origin for the thermal event, localized to Thorne's person. And the blunt force trauma? I asked. Fractures consistent with being thrown against a solid object, several ribs, a hairline crack in the sternum. But the trajectory seems odd. Not quite what I'd expect from an undirected blast wave originating from his workbench. She paused, her eyes narrowing as she studied the neck and jawline. There are also faint contusions here, almost ligature-like, but not deep enough to suggest strangulation. More like a very tight, momentary constriction. Ligature marks? That made no sense in the context of an explosion. My mind immediately discarded the accident theory, shifting it firmly into the deliberate column. A suicide bomb? Unlikely, given the faint marks. A struggle? Did you find anything unusual on his hands? I pressed. The medical examiner carefully examined Thorne's fingers, turning his hand over. Beyond the obvious thermal damage, no. Nothing readily apparent. She paused, then tilted his left hand, exposing the underside of his wrist. Wait. There's something here. Embedded in the skin, almost microscopic. She retrieved a pair of specialized forceps and a magnifying loupe. I leaned closer to the observation window, straining to see. With painstaking care, she extracted a minuscule shard. It was barely visible to the naked eye, a dark, crystalline speck. It's not glass, she stated, placing it on a sterile slide. And it's definitely not from the lab's equipment. I've seen enough shattered glassware and circuit board fragments to know the difference. My heart gave a sharp, unpleasant jolt. This was it. The first tangible thread leading away from the narrative of a tragic mishap. Can you analyze it? Immediately. I'll send it to trace evidence. But my gut tells me it's not organic. Some kind of synthetic, perhaps a composite material. A synthetic composite, embedded in the wrist, not from the lab, combined with ligature-like marks and an oddly focal burn pattern. The pieces didn't fit the accident puzzle at all. They screamed design. Later that afternoon, back in my office, the preliminary reports from the field investigators piled up on my desk, alongside the medical examiner's initial findings. The trace evidence team had confirmed the fragment was a highly stable, non-conductive ceramic composite, not found in Thorne's lab inventory. It was typically used in specialized, high-stress environments, applications far removed from bioengineering. I scrolled through the interview summaries. The first person of interest flagged was a rival scientist, a Dr. Silas Vance, from a competing research institution. Vance and Thorne had a history of bitter academic disputes, particularly over intellectual property rights related to Thorne's groundbreaking genetic sequencing technology. A colleague's interview detailed Vance's public accusations of Thorne stealing his initial concepts, a feud that had apparently intensified in recent months as Thorne's work gained more traction. Vance had the motive, professional jealousy, a desire to eliminate a competitor, and perhaps even to steal Thorne's research. He certainly had the scientific acumen to understand Thorne's work. Then there was Maya, a former research assistant. Her interview was terse, clipped with barely concealed anger. She'd worked for Thorne for 3 years before being abruptly dismissed 6 months ago. The reason given was a breach of confidentiality, but Maya claimed Thorne was paranoid, hyper-secretive, and had fired her simply because she'd asked too many questions about the nature of his final project, a project he guarded with extreme fervor. She felt wronged, cheated out of recognition for her contributions, and spoke of Thorne's ruthlessness in protecting his intellectual domain. She also possessed an intimate knowledge of the lab's layout, its protocols, and Thorne's habits. Vance, driven by professional rivalry. Maya, fueled by betrayal and resentment. Both had motives. Both had a connection to Thorne's work. And now, the preliminary autopsy pointed to something far more sinister than an accident. The unique ceramic fragment, the peculiar burn, the faint marks around Thorne's neck, they were all dissonant notes in a supposed symphony of misfortune. My determination hardened. This wasn't a tragic miscalculation. A microscopic, crystalline mistake. And I intended to find out who. The synthetic composite, embedded in the wrist, not from the lab, combined with ligature-like marks and an oddly focal burn pattern. The pieces didn't fit the accident puzzle at all. They screamed design. The air in the suite hummed with the quiet thrum of specialized equipment, server racks whispering behind glass, diagnostic screens glowing with intricate data streams. A technician, a sharp-eyed woman with her hair pulled back in a tight bun, was already at one of the workstations, meticulously cataloging items from Thorne's lab. On the heavy steel table beside her sat the confiscated heart of Thorne's research, a cluster of high-capacity hard drives, a sleek, custom-built laptop, and several encrypted data sticks, all meticulously bagged and tagged. "Anything interesting yet?" I asked, my voice a low rumble in the quiet space. The technician glanced up. "Just starting the deep dive, read. The encryption on these drives is a beast. Looks like Thorne didn't want anyone poking around." "He certainly didn't," I murmured, pulling up a chair to an adjacent terminal. "Prioritize the project files. Anything flagged as Project Chimera or Genesis Protocol. And look for any unusual access logs, especially in the last 72 hours. I watched as she initiated the cracking sequence on the primary research drive. A cascade of green code filling her screen. My own focus shifted to the physical evidence laid out before me, specifically the laptop. It was a custom job, built for performance, not portability. I ran a quick preliminary scan, bypassing the user interface, going straight for the raw data. Thorne's digital world was a labyrinth of complex algorithms and genetic sequences. The sheer scope of his work was staggering, hinting at applications far beyond simple medical cures. This wasn't just about tweaking a gene here or there, it felt like foundational architecture. Global health implications, certainly, but the shadow of bioweaponry, of engineered pathogens, loomed large over such powerful potential. The tension in the suite thickened, not from any immediate threat, but from the weight of the secrets I was beginning to uncover. Minutes bled into an hour. The technician beside me occasionally offered updates on the encryption's progress. I dug deeper into the laptop's system logs, searching for anomalies. That's when I found it. Not a direct deletion, not a simple overwrite. This was far more intricate. Timestamps for file modifications that didn't align with the system's internal clock. Fragmented log entries indicating multiple, rapid access attempts from an external IP that resolved to a ghost server. And then, the telltale signature of a sophisticated data wipe, not of the entire drive, but targeting specific directories, specific project files within the Genesis Protocol folder. It was an elegant, almost surgical, attempt to erase a digital footprint, leaving just enough corrupted data to suggest a system crash, but enough residual metadata for a trained eye to recognize the deliberate act. Someone didn't want this seen, I stated, more to myself than to the technician. My fingers hovered over the keyboard, the implications settling like lead in my gut. This wasn't a suicide. This wasn't an accident. Or perhaps, Thorne himself had been attempting to hide something critical, only to be interrupted. The thought sent a chill down my spine. Just then, the suite door opened, and the assistant stepped inside. Maya. Her eyes were red-rimmed, her face pale, etched with a fear that went beyond grief. "Thank you for coming," I said, my gaze softening slightly, but my mind racing. "Please, sit." I gestured to a chair opposite my terminal. "We're trying to understand Dr. Thorne's work, his recent activities. Can you tell me anything about his state of mind in the days before the incident?" She wrung her hands. He was different. Distant. He'd always been intense, but this was more. He kept talking about sabotage. About unseen eyes. He wouldn't elaborate, just these cryptic warnings. Her eyes darted around the room, as if expecting to find those unseen eyes even here, in the sterile examination suite. Sabotage? I pressed gently. Did he mention anyone specific? Just a feeling. He'd lock himself in the lab for days, not sleeping. He started moving files, encrypting everything, even things I thought were routine. He said someone was trying to steal his work, or worse, distort it. Distort it how? I asked, my attention fully on her, the data manipulation I just uncovered screaming in my mind. Her gaze dropped to her hands. He wouldn't say. Just that his research could be dangerous in the wrong hands. He was paranoid, read. Truly. He even mentioned feeling watched, even inside the lab. Her words, vague as they were, painted a vivid picture of a man under immense pressure, a man fearing betrayal. The attempted data wipe, the synthetic composite, the focused burn, Maya's fear, the pieces were beginning to coalesce into a terrifying mosaic. Thorne hadn't simply been working on groundbreaking research, he'd been fighting a battle, and he'd lost. And now, I was standing on the battlefield. The synthetic residue, a microscopic smear scraped from the charred edge of Thorne's console, glowed faintly under the spectrometer's beam. The previous chapter's ending, the witness's fear, still resonated in my mind, a discordant note against the official narrative of a tragic accident. My fingers danced across the console, adjusting the spectral range, fine-tuning the focus. Each peak and valley on the digital readout represented a unique chemical signature. I'd run the basic scans, cross-referenced against every known database, biological, geological, industrial, and come up empty. That in itself was significant. It wasn't organic, wasn't a common metal, wasn't a standard lab solvent. It was something else. I initiated a more advanced analysis, a deep scan electron spectroscopy. The apparatus whirred, a high-pitched whine building as the electrons bombarded the sample. On the main screen, the spectral lines sharpened, resolving into a complex pattern. My eyes narrowed, tracing the unfamiliar peaks. This wasn't just rare, it was bespoke. I started a new search query, expanding the parameters to include proprietary materials, experimental compounds, and niche industrial polymers. The system churned, sifting through millions of data points. Seconds stretched into minutes. The air in the suite grew heavy with anticipation. Then, a match. A single entry flashed on the screen, highlighted in amber. A synthetic polymer, incredibly durable, heat-resistant, and with an almost non-existent coefficient of friction. Its production was limited, specialized. Used in high-end industrial applications where extreme conditions and precise movement were critical. The material was manufactured by only a handful of companies globally, and its distribution was tightly controlled, often under non-disclosure agreements. My gaze snapped to the chemical composition. It wasn't just a polymer, it was the polymer. The spectral fingerprint was undeniable. This wasn't something you'd find in a typical research lab, not even one as advanced as Thorne's. It was a material designed for specific, demanding engineering feats, not for casual lab use. And its presence, however minute, on the very console where Thorne met his end, screamed intent. This shifted everything. The initial theories of suicide or a lab accident, already tenuous, now crumbled. A lab accident might involve an explosion, a chemical spill, but not the residue of a hyper-specialized synthetic polymer that shouldn't have been there in the first place. This wasn't a random contaminant, it was an active agent, or at the very least, a signature of an active agent. Thorne's research, I recalled from the preliminary reports, was largely funded by private entities, a consortium of venture capitalists and corporate giants eager to capitalize on his groundbreaking work. One name, in particular, stood out: Omnicorp. They were known for aggressive R&D, for pushing boundaries, and for acquiring smaller, innovative companies with relentless efficiency. They also had a reputation for developing their own proprietary materials for their diverse industrial portfolio, from aerospace to advanced robotics. The polymer fit their profile perfectly. Their liaison to Thorne's project. I need to speak with them, immediately. The call was arranged with surprising speed, almost too quickly. Within the hour, I was being ushered into the sleek, minimalist lobby of Omnicorp's gleaming headquarters, a monolith of glass and steel piercing the city skyline. The silence in the executive elevator was unnerving, broken only by the soft whoosh of air as we ascended. The company, I knew, valued efficiency above all else. My arrival, unscheduled and urgent, clearly ruffled their carefully maintained calm. The liaison, a woman named Ilara, met me in a sparsely decorated conference room overlooking the sprawling cityscape. He was impeccably dressed, her posture rigid, her smile practiced and a touch too wide. Thorne. A true visionary. Omnicorp valued his contributions immensely. She gestured to a chair opposite her at the polished obsidian table. I settled in, my gaze unwavering. Thank you for seeing me on such short notice, Ilara. My investigation into Dr. Thorne's demise has taken an interesting turn. We've identified a trace element at the incident site. A rare, synthetic polymer. Its properties suggest an industrial application, highly specialized. And its presence is, to put it mildly, anomalous. Ilara's smile didn't falter, but a subtle tension tightened the corners of her mouth. A polymer, you say? Well, Omnicorp is involved in many advanced material sciences. We have an extensive portfolio of proprietary compounds. It's not uncommon for our researchers to collaborate, share resources, even samples, with external partners like Dr. Thorne. Her explanation was too fluid, too ready. This particular polymer, I pressed, has a unique spectral signature. It matches a compound known internally as Project Chimera X. Am I correct in assuming Omnicorp is the sole producer of Chimera X? Her composure cracked, just for a microsecond. Her eyes darted to the conference room door, then back to me. Chimera X is indeed one of our advanced materials. A high-performance composite. It's under development. Very early stages. Its applications are highly sensitive, proprietary. She cleared her throat, regaining her footing. Dr. Thorne, in his capacity as a consultant on certain bioengineering aspects of a tangential project, may have had access to some preliminary data regarding its properties. Perhaps even a small sample for testing compatibility with his biological substrates. A small sample for testing, or for use in a device? I countered, my voice low. Because the residue we found suggests more than mere observation. It suggests active involvement, possibly mechanical. And its location, directly on the console, near the epicenter of the destruction, is highly suspicious. Ilara laced her fingers together on the table, her knuckles white. I assure you, investigator, Omnicorp has nothing to hide. Our relationship with Dr. Thorne was purely professional. We provided funding, resources, and intellectual support. We certainly had no motive to harm him. His research was immensely valuable to us. Her words were a torrent now, a defensive cascade. In fact, we were on the cusp of a major breakthrough with his work. His death is a significant setback for Omnicorp. Significant enough to warrant a cover-up? I asked, watching her carefully. Her pupils dilated almost imperceptibly. Of course not, she replied, perhaps a little too quickly. We are fully cooperating with your investigation. Anything you need, any data, any personnel you wish to speak with, we will provide. We want to see justice for Dr. Thorne just as much as you do. Her eagerness to cooperate, combined with her earlier evasiveness about Chimera X, felt like a meticulously crafted performance. The underlying tension in her posture, the slight tremor in her voice when discussing the polymer, told a different story. Thorne's paranoia about betrayal, about an attempted data wipe, about a synthetic trace. It all began to coalesce. This wasn't a random accident. It was a targeted event, and Omnicorp, with its proprietary materials and its valuable research, was now sitting squarely in the crosshairs. The web of connections was tightening, and I had a distinct feeling I had just tugged on one of its most dangerous threads. Hours had blurred into a single, focused pursuit. The trace polymer, the one I'd found near Thorne's body, was proving elusive. It wasn't on any public database, nor did it match any proprietary material I could cross-reference. That alone was a red flag. Thorne's work was cutting edge, yes, but to develop a material so utterly unique, one not even catalogued in his own extensive digital library, suggested a secrecy beyond standard R&D. The material's resistance to extreme temperatures and corrosive agents was extraordinary. It was designed for something specific, something requiring unparalleled durability. And it had been used, briefly, violently, in Thorne's lab. I leaned closer, adjusting the focus, trying to discern any imperfection, any telltale signature that might point to its origin. The material was pristine, almost too perfect. My gut tightened. This wasn't just a new polymer, it was a ghost. The overhead lights of the suite felt too bright, too sterile, as I finally pushed back from the console. My shoulders ached, but the frustration was quickly being replaced by a burgeoning sense of clarity. The more I dug, the more convinced I became, this wasn't an accident. Thorne hadn't just miscalculated. Someone had orchestrated this. Leaving the building after midnight, the cool night air was a welcome shock. The city was a muted tapestry of distant lights. I walked towards my car, keys already in hand, the silence of the nearly empty parking garage amplified by my own thoughts. As I reached my vehicle, a sudden, jarring roar ripped through the quiet. Headlights flared in my periphery. A dark sedan, moving far too fast for the confines of the garage, swerved sharply into the lane I was crossing, its tires squealing in protest. I froze, instinct taking over, and threw myself back against the pillar beside my car, the metallic shriek of the tires searing my ears. No brake lights. No hesitation. Just a deliberate, terrifying maneuver. My breath hitched. It wasn't random. The driver had aimed. They hadn't wanted to hit me, not directly, but to send a message. A clear, unmistakable warning. The adrenaline coursed through me, leaving a metallic taste in my mouth. My hands trembled as I fumbled with the car door. I drove home, the incident replaying in my mind, each detail sharpening the edges of my suspicion. This wasn't a coincidence. Not with the polymer still an enigma, and Thorne's death still screaming murder in my mind. The next morning, the unease lingered. I spent the early hours in my home office, a small, meticulously organized space I considered my sanctuary. It was where I kept my personal notes, my more sensitive case files, and my own small, specialized equipment. I reached for a specific case file, one I'd set aside regarding a previous, unrelated corporate espionage case, thinking there might be a tangential connection to the Chimera X project. That's when I noticed it. The spine of the file wasn't perfectly aligned with the others. A minute detail, one only I would catch. I pulled it out. The pages were in order, but the paper felt subtly different, almost imperceptibly warmer to the touch. I opened it, scanning the contents. Nothing seemed out of place. But the feeling persisted. Someone had been here. Someone had handled this file. My personal space, breached. The near miss in the garage wasn't an isolated incident. It was a pattern. I was contemplating my next move when my phone buzzed. It was Maya. I need to tell you something. I can't keep it to myself anymore. Not after. After what happened. What happened, Maya? I pressed, my mind already connecting her distress to the events of the last 12 hours. Last night. Someone tried to get into my apartment. I heard them at the lock. I didn't open it. They tried the handle, then they just left. I was so scared. Her voice cracked. And then this morning, when I went to Thorne's lab to clear out some of my personal items, the security console was acting strange. Like someone had bypassed the system, but then tried to cover their tracks. My grip on the phone tightened. Maya, what is it? What aren't you telling me? A shaky sigh. It's about Thorne. He was acting very strange in the weeks before. Before it happened. He was convinced someone was trying to steal his research. He'd often come in late, after everyone had left, and sometimes I saw him let someone in. An unknown individual. Not one of us. They would meet in his private lab. But I remember one time, the hood slipped back slightly as they were leaving. Just for a second. They had very striking, pale eyes. And a scar, a thin white line, just above their left eyebrow. Pale eyes. A scar. And a breach of security, both at Thorne's lab and now, implicitly, at my own home. Maya's sudden confession, prompted by her own fear, was the missing piece. The polymer, the accidents, Thorne's paranoia, and now an unknown, scarred individual accessing his lab in secret. This wasn't just a corporate rival. This was someone intimately involved, someone who knew the intricacies of Thorne's work, and someone who was now actively trying to derail my investigation. The game had just become deadly. And I was in it. I sat hunched over a bank of monitors, my eyes scanning lines of code and data logs, the glow reflecting in the polished surface of the console. The scent of ozone and stale coffee hung faintly in the air, a familiar comfort in the relentless pursuit of truth. My determination was a knot in my stomach, tightening with every anomaly I uncovered. On the main screen, a complex schematic of Thorne's lab pulsed, overlaid with real-time data streams captured from the moments leading up to the incident. Every sensor, every environmental control unit, every piece of experimental apparatus was represented, feeding me a deluge of information. It was like dissecting a digital corpse, meticulously searching for the precise moment life had been extinguished, and by whose hand. I began with the lab's environmental control system, the heart of its meticulously regulated atmosphere. Thorne's work demanded absolute precision, meaning any deviation, however minor, would be flagged. Not a leak, not a malfunction, but a deliberate, staggered adjustment. Found something, I murmured, leaning closer, my fingers flying across the holographic keyboard. The system log showed a sequence of commands initiated not from Thorne's internal console, but through an encrypted backdoor, a privilege escalation buried within the system's deep architecture. This wasn't a clumsy hack, it was an intimate understanding of Thorne's bespoke operating system. The commands were executed with an administrator-level clearance, overriding standard safety protocols. First, the primary ventilation system for the central chamber had been subtly throttled, reducing the air exchange rate to a critical minimum. This wasn't a complete shutdown, which would have triggered immediate alarms. It was a precise reduction, slow enough to avoid detection by automated checks, yet effective enough to allow for a gradual buildup of specific airborne compounds. Next, I cross-referenced the ventilation logs with the data from the experimental apparatus, specifically the bioreactor where Thorne had been cultivating his advanced polymer. The reactor's internal temperature had spiked, not catastrophically, but significantly beyond its operational parameters. Again, not a system failure, but an override. A secondary set of commands had briefly disengaged the thermal regulation safeguards, allowing the internal pressure and heat to climb unchecked for a calculated duration. This was the unusual burn pattern I'd noted on the bioreactor's exterior, localized scorching, not from an explosion, but from sustained, intense heat contained within, stressing the vessel's integrity. The microscopic trace, the iridescent polymer dust I'd collected, now made chilling sense. The final stage of the sequence was the most audacious. Once the atmosphere in the central chamber was sufficiently stagnant and the bioreactor critically overheated, a series of micro-releases from an auxiliary gas line had been triggered. These weren't the inert gases used for stabilization. They were a specific, highly reactive compound, carefully introduced. The timestamps were critical. The gas release had coincided precisely with the moment the bioreactor reached its peak internal pressure and temperature, just before its containment failed. The effect was a chain reaction, meticulously engineered. The reactive gas, now concentrated in the poorly ventilated chamber, combined with the superheated, volatile polymer vapor escaping the compromised bioreactor. The result was not a simple explosion, but a rapid, almost instantaneous combustion, consuming oxygen and generating a deadly cocktail of byproducts. This was the catastrophic lab accident everyone had initially assumed. But it wasn't an accident. It was a perfectly orchestrated chemical event. I pulled up the last recorded environmental readings from Thorne's personal monitoring device, retrieved from the scene. His oxygen levels plummeted in seconds. The air quality sensors registered a sudden, massive spike in highly toxic combustion products. He wouldn't have had time to react, let alone understand what was happening. This wasn't random, I muttered, my voice rough with the realization. This was a performance. The sheer precision, the multi-stage manipulation of separate, complex systems, ventilation, thermal regulation, gas delivery, all remotely triggered with administrator privileges, pointed to one inescapable conclusion. The perpetrator wasn't just familiar with Thorne's lab, they were an expert in its intricate, bespoke architecture and Thorne's specific experimental protocols. They knew which gas lines to tap, which ventilation ducts to restrict, which bioreactor safeguards to bypass, and crucially, the exact reactive properties of Thorne's groundbreaking polymer. It wasn't just about gaining access, it was about understanding the science within. This wasn't a clumsy break-in or a brute force hack. This was the work of an insider, someone who moved through Thorne's digital and physical domain with the confidence of a creator. The scarred individual, the polymer from the previous chapter, Thorne's paranoia, it all clicked into place with horrifying clarity. Someone had not only breached the lab's security but had weaponized its very design. My mind raced, connecting the digital breadcrumbs to the physical evidence. The specific burn patterns, the microscopic traces, the absence of forced entry, it wasn't a cover-up, it was the method. The killer had leveraged Thorne's own brilliance against him, twisting his life's work into an instrument of death. The tension in the suite thickened, an invisible weight pressing down. This wasn't just a murder, it was a declaration. A demonstration of power and knowledge. The killer wasn't just hiding their tracks, they were proving their mastery. And now, I had to find them. The pool of suspects had just shrunk to a terrifyingly specific demographic, those intimately familiar with Aris Thorne's unique genius, and with the ruthlessness to exploit it. The hunt had narrowed, but the danger had just escalated. My eyes, gritty from lack of sleep, scanned lines of code and data logs across 3 monitors, each displaying a different facet of Thorne's digital life. The sheer complexity of the remote system's manipulation still gnawed at me. It wasn't just about disabling safety protocols, it was an intricate ballet of environmental controls, precise gas delivery, and thermal regulation, all orchestrated to mimic a catastrophic accident while ensuring Thorne's demise. An expert's work, indeed. But why such an elaborate performance? Simple theft of research, the initial theory floated by the director, felt too shallow. A thief would grab the data and run. It spoke of a motive far more profound than mere acquisition. It spoke of prevention. I leaned back in my ergonomic chair, the plastic groaning softly under my weight. My gaze drifted from the screen to the sparse white walls, then back to the flickering pixels. I had spent the last 8 hours dissecting every byte of data recovered from Thorne's personal terminal and the lab's central server. Every communication, every research draft, every system update. Nothing overtly pointed to a rival, a disgruntled colleague, or a corporate spy. Thorne's official work logs were meticulously kept, detailing his groundbreaking bioengineering research with a level of precision that bordered on obsessive. But something felt missing, a hollow space in the narrative. My fingers danced across the keyboard, calling up the file directory for Thorne's archived projects. Hundreds of folders, each labeled with an alphanumeric code or a cryptic project name. I scrolled through them, a nagging feeling growing in my gut. Thorne was a man of patterns, of order. Yet, amidst the logical progression of his research, there were gaps, abrupt jumps in project numbering, and an unusual number of placeholder files that led nowhere. It was like looking at a meticulously arranged library with several shelves intentionally left bare. I focused on the system's metadata, searching for anomalies in file sizes or creation dates that didn't align with their reported content. Most were clean. Too clean. It was then I spotted it, a small, almost imperceptible discrepancy in the allocated block size for a seemingly empty directory labeled archive_x. It was a ghost in the machine, a directory with no visible contents but still consuming a minute amount of storage, inconsistent with an empty folder. A digital thumbprint left by something hidden. My heart gave a sharp, involuntary kick. This wasn't a standard oversight. This was a deliberate obfuscation. I spent another hour, maybe more, running various forensic tools against the directory, trying to force it open, to reveal its true nature. Standard decryption algorithms failed. My brow furrowed, a vein throbbing faintly at my temple. The perpetrator wouldn't have gone to such lengths to stage the accident only to leave a glaring backdoor. Thorne himself must have secured this. I switched tactics, cross-referencing the archive_x metadata with Thorne's personal communications, looking for any recurring keywords, any unusual phrases that might hint at a passphrase. Nothing immediately jumped out. Thorne was brilliant, but also, by all accounts, intensely private. He wouldn't have used anything obvious. A photo of a lone, ancient oak tree, its branches gnarled and reaching towards a stormy sky. Below it, a handwritten note, faded but legible: Veritas in radix. Truth in the root. A shot in the dark, but it was all I had. I typed Veritas in radix into the decryption prompt, my fingers hovering over the enter key. The system word, a brief pause, then a cascade of new directories and files populated the screen. Success. A wave of relief, sharp and potent, washed over me, quickly replaced by a surge of anticipation. The files were dense, encoded with a secondary layer of encryption that thankfully yielded to the same passphrase. These weren't research notes in the conventional sense. They were Thorne's personal reflections, his ethical dilemmas, his growing unease. I began to read, scrolling rapidly through the entries, my determination hardening with each paragraph. Thorne had become deeply troubled. His initial research, intended for therapeutic applications, had been secretly diverted, its potential weaponized. He detailed clandestine meetings with representatives from Omnicorp, not just as a funding source for his legitimate work, but as financiers for a separate, far more dangerous project. A project he had only recently uncovered, hidden within the labyrinthine corporate structure he had trusted. He wrote of Project Chimera, a twisted application of his genetic sequencing techniques, designed to create highly targeted biological agents. He expressed profound regret, a sense of personal complicity, and a growing fear for the implications of this hidden work. The entries became increasingly urgent, detailing his intent to expose Omnicorp's involvement, to blow the whistle on Chimera and its architects. He even mentioned compiling a comprehensive dossier, preparing to leak it to the authorities, to me specifically, though my name was coded. This wasn't just about theft or intellectual property. This was about silencing a conscience, preventing a public reckoning. The killer hadn't just wanted Thorne's work, they wanted to ensure his truth never saw the light of day. The tension in the suite thickened, pressing in on me. The perpetrator wasn't just an expert in Thorne's lab, they were an expert in human psychology, in manipulation. They understood the power of narrative, and they had carefully crafted one that would bury Thorne's accusations along with his body. This was no simple crime. This was a preemptive strike, a calculated act of corporate espionage and murder designed to protect a secret that could shatter the world. And I had just found the root of it all. A wave of relief, sharp and potent, had washed over me, but it was fleeting. The rush of adrenaline from successfully cracking Thorne's system had dissipated, leaving behind the cold reality of the task ahead. The room was a stark landscape of polished steel and muted gray, designed for focus, for stripping away distraction. My fingers, still tingling from the input, hovered over the keyboard. Veritas and Radix had opened the floodgates. Now, the real work began. I navigated through the newly accessible directories, a labyrinth of files I hadn't even known existed. The sheer volume of data was daunting, but I knew what I was hunting for: anomalies. The system logs, the access records, the internal communications, every digital footprint left by those who had passed through Thorne's secure domain. I started with the most critical, the facility's access logs for the past 6 months, cross-referencing them against the building's biometric entry points and the specific timeframe of the incident. The screen filled with timestamps, ID numbers, and entry/exit points. I filtered by time, narrowing the window to the week leading up to Thorne's demise. Dozens of names, dozens of entries. Too many to parse manually. I needed a different approach. The sabotage was sophisticated, implying a deep understanding of the lab's specific vulnerabilities in Thorne's research protocols. This wasn't a random break-in. This was precise. I pulled up the employee profiles next, focusing on those with high-level clearance to Thorne's specific research area. The list shortened considerably. These were the privileged few, the individuals who could bypass multiple security layers without raising immediate red flags. I cross-referenced this group with the newly decrypted project schematics, the detailed blueprints of Thorne's experimental apparatus, the very mechanism that had been weaponized. The specific technical expertise required to manipulate the system in such a fashion was immense. It wasn't just about knowing how to turn a dial, it was about understanding the fundamental principles, the pressure points, the cascading failures. I filtered the employee profiles by skill sets, advanced materials science, quantum computing protocols, high-energy plasma containment. The pool of potential suspects shrank further, coalescing into a tight cluster of 7 individuals. Each possessed the theoretical knowledge. But knowledge wasn't enough. They also needed opportunity and, crucially, motive. I began to dig deeper into each of the 7 profiles, searching for anything that stood out. Financial irregularities, interpersonal conflicts with Thorne, past disciplinary actions. Most were clean, their records reflecting solid, if unremarkable, careers. Then I hit a snag. Or rather, a sharp, unsettling spike in the data. One profile, belonging to the Omnicorp liaison, stood out like a beacon. His official role was to facilitate communication and resource allocation between Omnicorp and Thorne's independent research division. Standard corporate boilerplate. But beneath the surface, embedded in an obscure section of his personnel file marked Previous Engagements, I found a cryptic reference, Special Projects, Classified. A quick search of the internal FBI intelligence database, leveraging my own clearance, pulled up a more detailed, though still heavily redacted, history. The Omnicorp liaison had a past that was anything but typical for a corporate functionary. His background included stints in what were vaguely termed strategic asset protection and risk mitigation roles for various international conglomerates. The language was carefully chosen, but the underlying meaning was clear: covert operations. This was a man who understood infiltration, sabotage, and the art of making things disappear. My gaze sharpened, a knot forming in my stomach. This wasn't just a corporate liaison. This was a ghost in the machine. I pushed further, drilling into any public-facing records or news archives connected to his previous roles. It took some creative search queries, linking dates and corporate names to specific incidents, but then it materialized. A scandal from nearly a decade ago, a contentious legal battle involving a rival biotech firm and Omnicorp. The rival company had accused Omnicorp of industrial espionage, specifically the theft of groundbreaking intellectual property related to gene editing technology. The Omnicorp liaison had been tangentially mentioned in a few leaked documents, identified as a key negotiator in the settlement. A direct connection. Stolen intellectual property. Thorne's research was on the cusp of delivering world-changing technology, the kind that could redefine industries and generate unimaginable wealth. The perfect target for corporate espionage, or worse, elimination if he became a liability. The liaison's profile suddenly clicked into place, every piece of the puzzle slotting in with an unsettling precision. He had the expertise, the access, and a clear historical precedent for involvement in incidents concerning stolen intellectual property. He was a professional, an orchestrator. The intricate burn patterns on Thorne's lab equipment, the microscopic trace of a unique accelerant I'd found, the carefully designed accident, it all reeked of a calculated, deliberate act. An act that required someone intimately familiar with the system, someone with the skills to execute it flawlessly and then vanish, leaving behind only the illusion of tragedy. The Omnicorp liaison wasn't just a suspect, he was becoming the prime candidate for the inside man. I had a name, or at least, a role. And a motive that was as old as ambition itself. Relief, sharp and potent, had washed over me moments ago, but it had been fleeting. Cracking Aris Thorne's encrypted system was a victory, yet it only opened the next, more dangerous door. The cold reality of the task ahead settled in my gut. I had the key, now I needed to flush out the lockpicker. My fingers hovered over the keyboard. I had the raw data from Aris Thorne's final project, the bioweapon research he'd been trying to expose. The sheer destructive potential of it was chilling, a testament to the moral vacuum within Omnicorp. But the killer wouldn't react to the existence of the data, they'd react to its exposure. I needed to make them believe I was on the verge of that exposure, on the cusp of understanding Aris Thorne's intent to reveal it. I began crafting the bait. I created a dummy file, a heavily encrypted folder on a secured network drive, titled Thorne Project, Phase 2, Immunogenic Reversal Protocol, Breakthrough Analysis. The title was a deliberate misdirection. A technical phrase that would only resonate with someone intimately familiar with the specific, highly sensitive branch of Aris's work that Omnicorp wanted buried. It hinted at Aris having found a way to undo the bioweapon's effects, which, if true, would mean he also understood its creation perfectly. That would be a direct threat to Omnicorp's control. I then subtly manipulated the access logs, making it appear as if I had spent hours poring over this non-existent breakthrough file, downloading fragments to a local drive. The digital breadcrumbs were laid. The next step was the leak. A carefully phrased, misdirected email to a colleague, lamenting the complexity of Thorne's latest revelation and hinting at unforeseen implications for global health, would be enough. The subject line alone, referencing the dummy file, would ignite a panic. I hit send, then sat back, watching the clock tick. The waiting was the hardest part. I spent the next 24 hours in the suite, ostensibly working on other cases, but my attention was a tight coil. I had rigged my workstation with a silent proximity sensor, linked to my comm unit, and installed a discrete network monitor. If anyone tried to access my system, physically or remotely, I would know. It happened just after midnight. A faint ping vibrated against my hip. I was slumped in my chair, reviewing old case files, but the sound snapped me alert. The network monitor showed an attempted login, then a brief, successful access to my local drive from an external IP address, one that traced back, circuitously, to an Omnicorp subsidiary. Not a direct attack, but someone trying to poke around. Then, a few minutes later, the proximity sensor chirped. Someone was in the suite. I stayed absolutely still, my breathing shallow. The suite was dim, illuminated only by the glow of monitors. I heard the soft click of the door, then a hesitant shuffle. I could make out a silhouette moving towards my workstation. The figure wasn't stealthy, more urgent, desperate. I recognized the frame. David Thorne. He was fumbling with my keyboard, attempting to navigate the system. I heard a frustrated hiss as he encountered the system's security protocols, which I had deliberately strengthened around the dummy file. He froze, his shoulders hunching. He spun around, his face pale in the ambient light, eyes wide with a mixture of shock and dawning horror. "Reed," he stammered, his voice thin. "What? What are you doing here?" "My job," I replied, pushing myself out of my chair. The scrape of the wheels echoed. "The same thing I've been doing for the last few days, David. Unraveling your brother's death. And now, it seems, your involvement." He shook his head, a frantic denial. "I don't know what you're talking about. I was just passing by. Saw the light. At 1 in the morning? In a secure facility?" I stepped closer, my gaze unwavering. "You tried to access my workstation. You tried to erase a file. A file that only the killer, or someone working for them, would understand the significance of." He swallowed hard, his eyes darting around the room, searching for an escape that wasn't there. I panicked. I'd heard rumors about Aris's research. Rumors about my breakthrough into his immunogenic reversal protocol? I watched him flinch. "That was a trap, David. A very specific trap, designed to catch someone who understood the true nature of Aris's final work and the threat it posed to Omnicorp." I moved to a nearby evidence table, picking up a sealed bag. Inside, a microscopic fragment of polymer glinted under the light. "You remember this, don't you? This particular blend of polymer, a highly specialized, heat-resistant composite. We found trace elements of it in Aris's lab, embedded in the scorched remnants of the containment unit. It's what allowed the true weapon to be deployed without immediate detection, creating the illusion of an accident." His jaw tightened. He knew. "And we also found it, David," I continued, my voice low, "at other scenes. Other accidents that were dismissed, but always involving individuals with tangential connections to Omnicorp's more sensitive projects. And most recently, a fragment of the exact same polymer, identical in molecular structure, lodged in the sole of your shoe, recovered when you tripped near the perimeter fence of another Omnicorp research annex last month." I remembered that incident, initially flagged as a minor security breach and quickly dismissed. I'd stored the evidence, a gut feeling telling me it was more than it seemed. Now, it was a link in a deadly chain. His face crumbled. A faction within it. They knew Aris was going to expose them. He said he was going to blow the whistle on their bioweapon development program. He was going to leak everything. He looked up at me, his eyes pleading for understanding. They approached me. They said if I didn't neutralize him, they'd neutralize both of us and my family. They have resources, read. Influence. I didn't have a choice. The air in the suite thickened, heavy with the weight of his confession. The motive, the means, the intricate web of corporate malice, it all clicked into place. Aris Thorne wasn't a victim of a lab accident, he was a casualty in a war he didn't realize he was fighting alone, betrayed by his own blood. His confession, raw and devoid of genuine contrition, still echoed in my ears as the two agents moved in. Their movements were precise, practiced, a silent ballet of law enforcement. The metallic click of the restraints was definitive, a stark punctuation mark on a narrative I'd spent weeks painstakingly unraveling. I watched David Thorne, his face now stripped of its pretense, settle into a chilling calm. No defiance, no desperate plea, just a quiet resignation that spoke volumes of a calculated risk gone awry. He met my gaze for a fleeting moment, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes before he was led away, the door closing behind him with a soft thud that felt disproportionately loud. I stood there for a beat longer, the hum of the ventilation system suddenly prominent. My colleagues, a lead investigator and a junior analyst, began packing up their equipment, their relief evident in the subtle loosening of their shoulders. The room, usually a crucible of intense focus, now felt hollowed out, the energy drained. I felt a profound weariness settle into my bones, a counterpoint to the surge of grim satisfaction. The case was closed, at least in its most immediate form. The next few days blurred into a relentless procession of reports, briefings, and secure communications. The implications of David Thorne's actions, and the corporate malfeasance he'd exposed, rippled outwards with astonishing speed. My findings, coupled with his detailed testimony, provided the leverage needed to crack open Omnicorp's shell. High-profile arrests followed, a domino effect that started with a few senior executives and quickly escalated to board members. The names, once whispered in hushed tones in corporate corridors, now screamed from every news outlet. The media firestorm was immediate and intense. Every screen in the agency, from the breakroom television to the secure monitors in the director's office, blared headlines about the Omnicorp scandal and the Thorne betrayal. Analysts dissected every detail, legal experts debated the charges, and commentators decried the ethical vacuum at the heart of corporate power. I saw my own face, pixelated and serious, flash across screens as part of the investigative team. It was a strange, disorienting experience, seeing the meticulously gathered evidence distilled into sound bites and sensationalist headlines. The collective shock was palpable, a stark reminder of how easily trust could be eroded by ambition. The ethical debate surrounding scientific advancement and corporate responsibility exploded into the national consciousness. Aris Thorne's research, once a guarded secret, was now the subject of intense public scrutiny. What exactly had he been working on? What were its capabilities? And who should control such potentially world-changing technology? These questions became the new battleground. I overheard snippets of conversations in the hallways, saw the frantic pace of the high-level meetings being scheduled. Governments and international organizations, initially silent observers, were now actively vying for control over the remnants of Thorne's work. The implications were staggering, reaching far beyond the confines of a single corporate crime. My own role transitioned from active investigation to providing expert testimony and detailed analyses. I found myself in conference rooms filled with uniformed officials and sharp-suited lawyers, explaining burn patterns and trace particulates, each detail a piece of the larger, terrifying puzzle. The determination that had fueled me through the long nights now shifted. It wasn't just about finding a killer anymore, it was about ensuring that the truth, in its entirety, saw the light of day. The future of Aris Thorne's research hung precariously in the balance, a powerful invention born from genius and tragedy, now a prize to be contended for. I had brought the killer to justice, but the real aftermath, the true reckoning, had only just begun. The tension wasn't gone, it had merely transformed, expanding to encompass the global stage. It was a silence that swallowed sound, leaving only the dull hum of ventilation and the ghost of David Thorne's voice, raw and unrepentant, still scraping at the edges of my hearing. The two agents had escorted him away with a practiced efficiency that spoke of countless similar encounters, leaving me alone with the aftermath. I walked to the large observation window, my gaze sweeping across the array of high-tech equipment that had been our crucible for truth. The environmental controls, meticulously tuned to replicate the disaster site, now merely regulated the room's temperature, a sterile hum against the weight of what had transpired here. Justice, in this sterile room, felt less like triumph and more like a grim necessity. My fingers traced the cool glass of the window, a barrier between me and the silent lab beyond. Aris Thorne's genius, once a beacon of progress, had ultimately illuminated a path to his own destruction. His vision, so grand and world-altering, had been perverted by the very hands he might have trusted. David Thorne's confession hadn't just exposed a killer, it had laid bare the terrifying fragility of scientific ethics, the ease with which ambition could curdle into something monstrous. He hadn't killed for money alone, though that was a significant driver. He'd killed for control, for the power to direct his brother's legacy, to twist it into a tool for his own gain, irrespective of the catastrophic global implications. He hadn't just wanted to profit, he wanted to dominate. The weight of it pressed down on me, a familiar ache behind my eyes. This wasn't just another case, another puzzle solved. This was a stark reminder of the knife-edge humanity walked, perpetually balancing on the precipice between groundbreaking innovation and profound peril. Aris Thorne had been on the verge of something that could have eradicated famine or reshaped entire ecosystems. David Thorne saw only the profit margin in controlling that power, blind to the wider good, or perhaps, deliberately indifferent to it. The chief forensic officer entered the suite, a folder tucked under his arm. He moved with a quiet authority, his eyes meeting mine with a knowing weariness. "Read," he said, his voice low, "it's done. The confession is watertight." He wasn't just after the money from the sale. He wanted to be the sole gatekeeper of his brother's work. To control its release. Its application, its very existence. The chief sighed, running a hand over his close-cropped hair. A true perversion of scientific progress. Aris Thorne's dream turned into a global chokehold. He set the folder on a nearby workstation, its crisp edges a stark contrast to the lingering unease in the room. "The final reports are being compiled. Your findings were critical. Without your microscopic trace analysis, the burn pattern, the subtle discrepancies in the lab's environmental readings, we might have dismissed it as a tragic accident. This was the event, the quiet, procedural closing of a chapter, yet loaded with the profound significance of its contents." He slid the folder across the polished surface towards me. "Sign off, read." The crisp paper felt heavy in my hands, each page representing countless hours, meticulous observation, and the grim reality of human depravity. The faces of the victims, the twisted logic of the perpetrators, they all left their mark. I felt the familiar exhaustion, a deep-seated weariness that no amount of sleep could fully erase. Yet, beneath it, a stubborn ember of resolve still glowed. This work was a burden, yes, but it was also a shield. The struggle between progress and peril wasn't confined to the laboratory, it played out in every corner of society, and my role was to stand on the side of accountability. I signed the document, my pen scratching faintly against the paper. The act felt definitive, a final punctuation mark on Aris Thorne's tragic story. But as I pushed the folder back, my gaze fell upon a different file, already placed on the corner of my workstation. It was thinner, less imposing, but the prominent red priority stamp on its cover caught my eye. A new case. A new challenge. The chief followed my gaze. Another one just came in, read. Highly sensitive. Appears to be an unexplained incident at a secure underground bunker facility in the remote desert. Initial reports are. The tension in the room shifted, no longer rooted in the past, but subtly hinting at the future. I picked up the new file, its cover cool beneath my fingertips. The intricate dance between ingenuity and malevolence would continue, and so, too, would my part in it.